Hello. First of all, I hope you're all being safe during this whole coronavirus outbreak. I don't typically talk about current events because I know that's not what people are watching this video for, but given what's going on, I would feel remiss not to at least say I hope you're all being safe and healthy during this outbreak, and I hope you're being smart too. I hope you're using common sense, and if you do have it, I wish you a speedy recovery. But that's all I'm gonna say about it. That's not what this video is. This is a book review, in case you couldn't tell from the title, and the book I want to review is Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. Now, I already reviewed this book years and years ago. Technically, my old review is still up, however, it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but I'll leave a link to it in the description below. I wanted to redo the review, one, because I actually wanted to reread the book, but also because, and I say this every time I do a re-review, but my old review just sucked. Basically, in my old review, and you can see it for yourself if you decide to watch it, it was literally just me explaining the plot of the book and then saying, it's a very good book. That was the extent of my criticism and my analysis. So, I wanted to do a hopefully more in-depth review of Interview with the Vampire. Now, Interview with the Vampire was published in 1976, and this is the first book of what is now known as the Vampire Chronicles. I'll talk more about the sequels to this book after I review the novel proper. Now, the plot of Interview with the Vampire is it begins where this young journalist or interviewer, simply referred to as the boy, you find out later on in the series that this character's name is Daniel, but Daniel, or the boy, he interviews this man named Louis, who claims to be a vampire, and as the book goes on, he starts to realize, oh my god, this man actually is a vampire, and Louis tells him his life story, or at least his life after he became a vampire, and essentially the whole book is this long monologue from Louis about his existence as this vampiric being. So, you find out that Louis was a young plantation owner in 18th century Louisiana, and following the death of his brother, he was attacked and turned by a vampire named Lestat. And Louis and Lestat develop a very complex and complicated relationship. Lestat enjoys being a vampire and takes great pleasure in not just killing people, but also tormenting his victims beforehand, whereas Louis is very remorseful and hates what he has to do in order to survive. And one night, Louis, in a fit of hunger, attacks this little girl, and he's devastated by this, but Lestat, of course, is amused by this, and after this, Lestat ends up turning this little girl. But this little girl, Claudia, I don't remember in the book whether Anne Rice said that was her name beforehand, or if that's the name they gave her, but Claudia essentially becomes Louis and Lestat's daughter. Years and eventually decades go by, and Claudia remains a little girl, but mentally she matures, and she starts to develop a deep hatred for Lestat because of his cruelty and his abuse. Eventually, she devises a plan for her and Louis to escape from him. I won't give away how they do this or what Claudia does, but eventually Claudia and Louis escape to Europe, where they look for others of their kind, and eventually they do find other vampires, which I won't give away what happens in the second half of the story. When I start talking about individual characters, that's when I'll get into some minor spoilers, but let's just say it's not exactly what they would have wanted. Now, Interview with the Vampire is a great book. It does have a writing style and even some dialogue that could be considered kind of melodramatic, but one thing I think is really interesting about this book is, since most of it is taking place in the 18th and 19th century, honestly, it has a writing style that is very similar to a lot of literature at that time period. And in this book, you get a real feel for the time period that Louis is describing to Daniel. And this book is not just a horror novel, it's very much a drama as well. It's very much about the interpersonal relationships between these characters. Now, this book has inspired so much that reading it today, it might not seem that original, but for the time, this was a very unique take on the vampire genre. Now, typically in vampire literature, vampires are supposed to be the spawns of Satan. That's why crosses and holy water work against them. But Anne Rice's vampires are not inherently evil. I guess from the point of view of the people that they're going after, I guess from the humans' point of view, Louis, Lestat, and Claudia would be evil, but really they're just evolved beyond us. Now, certainly this is not the first vampire story to sort of mess around with the conventions of the genre. Prior to this, you had Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, which also sort of turned the genre on its ear. But this was one of the first vampire stories, at least that I could think of, where the vampires are truly the main characters. Prior to this in vampire literature, you're not supposed to root for the vampire. Vampires are typically the villains of their stories, and you're supposed to root for the human characters in their struggle against the vampires. Like, if you go back to something like Bram Stoker's Dracula, you're not supposed to root for Dracula in that story. You're supposed to root for Jonathan Harker and Mina and Van Helsing. So again, this is one of the first vampire stories, at least that I could think of, where it really is from the vampire's perspective. Now, to talk about the characters in this book, obviously Lestat has kind of become the fan favorite. I think that's evident by the fact that he's basically the main protagonist throughout the rest of the series, so I think it's interesting how he starts out the series as the villain. But Louis and Lestat's relationship is one of the most interesting things about this story because it starts out as sort of a master-slash-pupil relationship, but soon develops into more of a brotherly kind of relationship, but eventually it develops to a point where you could honestly call Louis and Lestat lovers. Like, there are a lot of homoerotic undertones in the novel. There's no actual sex between the vampires, but even the scene where Lestat is giving Louis his blood in order to turn him into a vampire, the way that scene is described, it's described almost as a sexual act. Like, it is the exchanging of fluids. And when you see both Louis and Lestat trying to raise Claudia, essentially they are a same-sex couple. But it's also very much an abusive relationship. Like, Lestat is very abusive, and he's very demeaning. Anne Rice definitely made this character more sympathetic in the sequels, but in this first novel, he is very much the villain. But while Lestat is a great character, and Louis is a very good character, for me the most compelling character in this novel is Claudia. One of the things that's so interesting about this character is because she's turned into a vampire as a little girl, she never ages, yet as decades go by, mentally she ages, and it gets to a point where she does become a woman trapped in a child's body. And the book does a really good job at portraying just how horrible that would actually be. Like, it gets to a point in the novel where Claudia, if she were human, would be in her 60s, and yet she's seeing all these young women who she's technically older than at this point, yet she's still in the body of a little girl. Like, she desires to become a fully grown woman, and yet that can never happen. And Louis and Claudia's relationship is very interesting, where it starts out as a father-daughter relationship, but as Claudia mentally matures, it does kind of become, and I know this is going to sound creepy, but it does kind of become a lover kind of relationship. And Claudia is also an interesting character in the sense that she develops a deep hatred for Lestat, yet she, oddly enough, has more in common with Lestat than she does Louis. Actually, there are points in this novel where she can be even more cruel than Lestat. And to go back to the character of Louis, part of Louis' self-loathing comes from the fact that he can't let go of being human. Yes, he's no longer a human being, but he can't let go of the emotions he felt as a human being, and he can't let go of his human lifetime. Now, in the second half of the story, Louis and Claudia go to Europe looking for other vampires, and they do actually discover these creatures in Eastern Europe called revenants, which are basically vampires with no real intelligence. Essentially, they're just zombies that feed on blood. But then when they go to Paris, they do discover a theater run by a coven of vampires, and this is where you're introduced to the character of Armand, who would go on to become a reoccurring character throughout this whole series. And him and Louis do develop a very interesting relationship. You're also introduced to a vampire named Santiago, who is a real nasty character. In a lot of ways, he's the main villain of the second half of the novel, and in a lot of ways, he's even more despicable than Lestat. Another interesting character in this book is Daniel, the boy interviewing Louis throughout this whole thing. What I find intriguing about Daniel is in a lot of ways he's not properly a character, rather he's a metaphor for the audience. He's a metaphor for the reader. A lot of Daniel's questions would be questions that we would have. And with all the stuff in this book dealing with Daniel, you get a real sense of just how different these creatures are from us. Like, there's a point towards the beginning of the novel where Louis is trying to fix something on Daniel's shirt, or he's trying to light a cigarette for Daniel, but, like, he reaches out towards Daniel, and he moves so fast that from Daniel's point of view, it looks like his arm is elongating. So, even though Anne Rice humanizes these creatures, you still get a sense of how different they are from us. And one thing I also think is interesting is how even though we're dealing with supernatural creatures here, you realize that they're just as in the dark about the secrets of the universe as normal humans would be. And there's a lot of conversations in this book about the existence of God, the existence of the devil. Are the vampires the children of Satan? They don't know. And what is the point of even fearing God when you're immortal, when you know you're not going to die, so what is the point of even fearing the possibility of damnation? Another major theme in this book is definitely the passage of time. Armand even brings up to Louis how a major problem that vampires run into is the fact that since you're immortal, society is a constantly changing thing, but you'll never be able to let go of the time period you were born in. So you will live to see whatever future societies there will be, but do you really want to see how society changes in the future? But yeah, Interview with the Vampire is a very good book. Again, I do personally like some of the sequels better than this, but it's still a very good book and I would highly recommend it. Now, in 1985, Anne Rice published a sequel to this, The Vampire Lestat, which was all told from Lestat's point of view. That was followed by The Queen of the Damned in 1988, and then that was followed by The Tale of the Body Thief in 1992, and then that was followed by Menok the Devil in 1995. Now, Menok the Devil was the last book in the series that I read, but the series went on after that. I think so far there have been 12 or 13 books in this series. Anne Rice also did a spin-off series called New Tales of the Vampires, and she wrote a series called Lives of the Mayfair Witches, which is about witches, but it's in the same universe as the Vampire Chronicles, because there were several crossovers between the two series. And apparently her book, The Mummy, or Ramses of the Damned, is also in the same universe as this. Now, I'm going to cut to two short reviews on this book done by two friends of mine. When it cuts back to me, I'm going to be talking about the 1994 film adaptation of Interview with the Vampire.
Hello. My friend Christian has asked me to do a short review on Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. This is not the copy I originally read back when I was a teenager. I had a little paperback back then, but I upgraded to a nice hardcover with that iconic, simple cover. Interview with the Vampire was Anne Rice's first published novel in 1976. And she's often said in interviews it wasn't a runaway bestseller or instant hit or anything when it came out. For the most part, people found it a little strange. Vampire fiction wasn't as big as it is now, back then, and just for someone to treat it so seriously, where all the characters were vampires and it explored their feelings, it was kind of ahead of its time. It has since become a classic, a huge bestseller, probably her most well-known book. Interview with the Vampire, I think, was the second Anne Rice novel I read. The first one I read was The Witching Hour. But Interview with the Vampire, I can see there's such strength in this novel. The language in this novel, as in a lot of Anne Rice novels, can be very extravagant, very almost flowery. But I mean, that is her style, and she loves to explore just the language through telling a story. And she can do just pages and pages on description of places, of rooms, of a feast that is spread out, but she does it in such a way that, for me, it's still very compelling. Now, the story of Interview with the Vampire, it's not heavily plot-driven. It's very episodic in nature. It's a series of events that happens. It starts when a young man named Louis, who is grieving the death of his brother, is feeling suicidal. He meets a vampire named Lestat, who gives him eternal life, turns him into a vampire. And then Louis is struggling with his own feelings of, should I be taking life? Am I an abomination? And then at some point they turn a little girl, Claudia, into a vampire and become sort of a strange little family. And things take a tragic turn. And then we travel overseas and meet more vampires. And there's the theater of the vampires. And there's betrayal and death and grieving. And I mean, like I said, it's very episodic, but it really whisks you away. It takes you on a journey. The thing I really like about Anne Rice is she creates this whole romanticized world that you just get swept up in. And it's very heightened. It's not the stuff of everyday life. That stuff does not interest her as a writer, so she always wants to take you on this grandiose journey to like almost another realm, and she does it very well. Interview with the Vampire, I think, is a wonderful novel that does a lot of things that were very bold for its time. And she often says that using supernatural elements and creatures helps her talk about the important themes in life, you know, our struggle within ourselves of good and evil, and are we good? Are we evil? Are we following our destiny? Are we making our own destiny? And I think she does that very well. Now, this Vampire series went on for a while. The next two in the series, Vampire Lestat and Queen of the Damned, I think actually were probably some of the best. Later on, it gets a little repetitive. Then I think she came back with a little strength after a while. But this started it all, and it's a great start. It's a great novel. I definitely recommend it.
Every time I see the title of this book, I always think about the Mandela Effect. Now, I don't believe in the Mandela Effect, but this is one of the few things in existence that really makes me question whether it's real or not. And I don't know why. Because I've always known that it was Interview with the Vampire. So, yeah. Anyway, enough about that. Interview with the Vampire. This is Anne Rice's greatest book, in my opinion. I love Interview with the Vampire. It takes what I love most about the Universal Horror stories, which is, you know, taking a monster, making them sympathetic, making them the hero of the story, making you love them, and still making them monsters. It's very Frankenstein-ish in that way. Now, yeah, these vampires are not innocent, but just in the sense that you feel sympathetic for Louis, you feel sympathetic for the little girl. Lestat, not so much, because you don't get into that until the next book. Not to spoil, the next book, but at the same time, you do feel sympathy for these creatures, because you realize they're alone. They're dealing with all the stuff of being a vampire, and this curse that's put upon them. And I love the way Anne Rice writes it. She's very poetic in that way. To me, she's a poet, and I don't mean that in the sense that this is written like a poem. I just mean in the sense that the same way Tupac Shakur is a poet. Now, yeah, he did write poetry because his raps were rhythmic and lyrical and all that stuff. But at the same time, it was deeper than just we're gonna rhyme. You know what I mean? It was more about the substance of the poems, and it was the substance of the raps. And it's the same thing with this. It's the substance of these stories. It's what these stories are about. When you dig deeper, you see isolation. She talks about religion. She talks about sexuality. And she does it in such a beautiful way that it doesn't become preachy. And it's really just nice how she does it. It's very subtle, but it's very understandable. It's very, accessible. And her writing itself, her prose style is amazing. I love the way she describes stuff. I love this book so much. It's beautifully paced. She paces it well. It really is just a great, fun read. It's not a short book, but it definitely feels like a short book if you get into it. Because I know that every time I've picked up this book, I read it within a day or so, and it's just, time just flies by. You don't even feel like it's been however many pages it's been. Like, it's just a great, story. It just really is. You get really intrigued. You get lost in it. You feel like you're with them. You understand them. There are some really creepy scenes in it. There's a part with some creatures called the Revenants. That's all I'll say. But that scene itself, creepy. I mean, really creepy. And I didn't expect that because you don't see that in the movie. There's certain things that happen in the movie or happen in the book that don't happen in the movie. And that's why, for me, just personally, I think the book is better. But that's unfair to say because most of the time that's the case. It's really unfair to judge a book, a movie based on its book, because it's two different art forms. But just in the sense that there's a lot more stuff in this book that really surprised me when I read it. So even if you've seen the movie 100 times, and you say, oh, I already know the story, why would I read this book? Trust me, you pick up this book, you're going to see a lot more things that you didn't get to see in the movie. And it's going to really surprise you. It's going to really keep you intrigued. You're going to really enjoy it. And yeah, this is a fantastic read, story-wise, prose style, characters, everything. This is just an amazing book. I love this book to death. Recommend it for everybody. And yeah, that's my review. Thank you so much.
So, I hope you enjoyed Mark and Christian's reviews on this book. Now, this book was adapted into a film of the same name in 1994, which was directed by Neil Jordan, who also directed The Crying Game. I personally think it's a great movie. It does change a little bit from the book, but it stays true to the basic themes of the novel. Now, in the film, Brad Pitt played Louis, and Tom Cruise played Lestat. Now, I've never been a huge Tom Cruise fan. For me, he's always been one of those actors who kind of plays a similar character in every movie he's in, but Lestat was not one of those performances. Like, I honestly think it's probably his best performance, at least next to his performance as Ron Kovic in Born on the 4th of July. Like, he was not Tom Cruise in this movie. He was Lestat. He really did disappear into this role, and I give him a lot of credit for that. The movie also had a very young Kirsten Dunst as Claudia, and it was a phenomenal performance. You also had Antonio Banderas as Armand, and Christian Slater played Daniel. Now, originally Daniel was going to be played by River Phoenix, but he unfortunately died a few weeks before his scenes were going to be shot. Now, Interview with the Vampire was a pretty big hit when it came out, but for whatever reason, there was never a direct sequel. Like, they never followed the movie up with a direct adaptation of The Vampire Lestat, even though the movie ended where it would lead directly into that. Instead, in 2002, we got an adaptation of the third book in the series, Queen of the Damned, which incorporated some elements of The Vampire Lestat. But that movie was not a direct sequel to Interview with the Vampire, even though Lestat also showed up in that movie, but in that movie he was played by a different actor. And also, that movie kind of sucked. The book was excellent, but the movie blew. Now, there have been several plays and musicals based on the characters from The Vampire Chronicles, and there were several comic book adaptations of this book. And this book really did have a huge influence on future vampire stories. Like, honestly, and people are gonna hate me for saying this, but I actually think something like Twilight wouldn't exist if not for Anne Rice's influence on the genre. And I know there's probably some people who want to kill me for even using Anne Rice and Twilight in the same sentence. But yeah, that was my review on Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, and bye.